Formation. Oh, okay. I'm Joanne Lee, Associate Pastor for Community Formation at Calvary Presbyterian Church in San Francisco. During this pandemic, we can't gather as we normally would, but we still want to provide opportunities for learning as well as keep people connected to our ministries. This faith community has a commitment to adult education and spiritual formation, sponsoring online gatherings on Sundays as well as other times. And this congregation and our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, has a long history of working for social justice and racial justice. And this book that we read together this summer, The White Devil's Daughters, tells a bit of that history. For me personally, growing up as an Asian American in the Presbyterian Church, I knew of Cameron House because so many of my own Asian American mentors and leaders had grown up there and served there, and I stand on the shoulders of those who have been formed by Cameron House. So reading this history was especially poignant for me. As we get started, our pastor and head of staff, the Reverend Marcy Glass, will open us in prayer. Marcy?
Good morning, everyone. Let us pray. Holy One, we stand on the shoulders of those who have come before us, and we recognize that sometimes that was in ways good or in ways bad. So help us to climb down from the shoulders of racism that have propped up systems of injustice and slavery and inequity. Help us to climb down from the shoulders of sexism that have kept women from full flourishing in society and that have kept men in roles that didn't always match their gifts. Keep us firmly balanced on shoulders of justice that we may be agents of your change. And keep us firmly balanced on shoulders of mercy that we may offer kindness and refuge to those fleeing violence and danger. We give thanks, O God, for women like Donaldina Cameron and Tien Phu Wu and the people who supported their work to create a legacy of compassion and safety here in our city, a reminder of how we can gladden the hearts of people we meet and serve. Help us, O God, be deeply rooted in your word and in your heart, that we may be support for generations to come, giving them firm foundations on which to stand as they participate in your work and witness. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Marcy. So in terms of format this morning, we would ask that you stay muted unless you're called on to ask your question. We'll first hear from Julia. She has some slides and stories to share with us. And then Calvary member Kathy Bear, who is the Elder for Adult Education, will moderate a question and answer session. Now, we had originally planned to do that via the chat function of your Zoom, but that is, as technology sometimes does, not currently working. So what we're going to do is, if you go to the participants list, there is a raise hand button. So after Julia does her slides, and then Kathy has some questions that were sent to her ahead of time. So we'll start with a couple of those, and then you can kind of raise your hand, and when Kathy calls on you, you can ask your question. We obviously won't get to everybody or all of your questions, but we'll do the best to get to the best and a good sampling of all of them. All right, so this summer, our church read together The White Devil's Daughters by Julia Flynn Siler. Ms. Siler is here with us today on this live Zoom gathering. Hi, Julia. We got to see her dog if you were here earlier. Julia is a New York Times bestselling author and journalist. She's worked as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and Business Week magazine. She's been on PBS, which I believe she may talk a little bit more about later. And she is a Bay Area native, born right here in Palo Alto and still living in the area. Julia, thank you again for being here. And everyone, please join me in welcoming Julia with the ASL sign for applause. This is what that is.
Group of courageous women who fought for social justice. And there's a very strong tie to Calvary Presbyterian, which I know you know. And I think we're all feeling a bit discouraged after 6 months and the wildfires and everything going on in our world. And my true hope is that this helps us to remember that even in the darkest times, there are ways out, and small groups of people can make change in our world. So that's what I hope you'll take away from this story. So let's begin in 1873. in San Francisco. Let me lay the scene out for you. I know many of you have read the book already, but I think that by focusing on some of these images, I'll tell you the story in a slightly different way. Imagine San Francisco in 1873. That was the summer when the first cable car rolled up the streets, the very steep streets, in this case of Sacramento Street, which you're seeing towards Nob Hill. Many of the streets were cobblestoned, as you see here, and they were lit by gas lamps at night. It was a booming time in the city's history. There was almost continual construction. Now, the city was also a very rough place. There was, of course, the port of San Francisco, which was the largest port in the West Coast. And there were ships continually coming in and out. And a great deal of people coming in and leaving for other parts of the West. In particular, it was a city that was full of places for sailors and for people traveling to eat and drink, entertained, and find sex. As one newspaper reporter in the 19th century wrote, San Francisco was the cussedest place for women. And I like to show this photograph because of the woman's face in the foreground. It really seems to capture what a desperate place San Francisco could be if you were a vulnerable or impoverished woman at that time. Now, San Francisco's Chinatown in particular was in the heart of the city, just as it is today, centered around Portsmouth Square. It was a very densely packed neighborhood with roughly 12,000 people packed into what was then about 8 square blocks. And many of those people were men, giving rise to the nickname of the community as a bachelor society. And this photograph so beautifully captures that, the way that the men are on the streets and you don't see a single woman. That gave the fact that there was this immense gender inequity in Chinatown, but in the city as a whole as well, led to the demand for sex in the city. And this is a photograph from the Bancroft Library of a prostitute in Chinatown in the 19th century. And there was a demand for both in Chinatown for sex from both white men and from Chinese men. And there was a very thriving, very lucrative business in the trafficking of women during those days. And then it was a business that was supported again by not only criminal gangs, many of whom had their origins in China, but also the white officials, the immigration officials and the police officials who often aided the trafficking of women. Now, the life of a girl or a young woman who was trafficked into San Francisco in the late 19th, early 20th century was a very, very difficult one. The average life expectancy might have been 4 years or 5 years due to abuse and disease and to just the hardships. And of course, remember, this is a time after the 13th Amendment to the Constitution had been passed by Congress, which of course outlawed slavery. Yet there were open auctions in the city of San Francisco taking place of Asian women who were disembarking from the ships. And those women would be brought by cart up to Chinatown and elsewhere and sold off at auction to the highest bidder. This is a photograph of what was then known in the 19th century as the slave girl trade. This is probably the most iconic photograph of a so-called slave girl. Again, this is from the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. Now, oh my goodness, sorry, this photograph is not as good as I wish it had been. I got it off the site of the San Francisco Public Library's History Center, and I do apologize. This is a photograph of Calvary Presbyterian. And this is in the days when it was about 6 blocks away from Union Square. And a very key and important thing happened in 1873 at Calvary Presbyterian, and that was a gathering of women, mostly, who had come to hear a visiting missionary talk about the plight of Chinese girls and women. And many of the women who came to hear this speaker left before it really ended, or as soon as it ended. But a few stayed, and they wanted to learn more. And they met again and again, and they ended up coming up with the idea of creating a safe home for trafficked girls and women in San Francisco. Now let's remember the backdrop to this decision to do this. This was a time when there were riots. The Sandlot riots is probably the most famous of them, against the Chinese in San Francisco and really across the West. There was virulent racism against the Chinese at this time. So it really speaks to the faith and the willingness to challenge the norms that this group of women, Presbyterian women, decided to embark upon this project. And they first opened up a little apartment for the trafficked women. And then they managed to raise enough money to buy this very substantial house on Sacramento Street. This is a photograph of the original house. It was really quite big. And they had some pretty socially prominent early backers. Probably the most famous was Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who early on was a Presbyterian. And so they managed to staff and run this house for 7 decades. It opened, the apartment opened in 1874. They soon moved over to this house. And it ran as a safe house for girls and women through the mid-1930s, 7 decades, which is pretty amazing because it was an all-volunteer organization closely affiliated with the church. Now, what the house embarked on was what they called rescue work. You know this from reading the book, and I just love this photograph, which was almost certainly staged for newspapers of a classic rescue. And I look at this photograph, and to me, it tells me something a little different than perhaps what a newspaper reader in the early 20th century might have seen looking at it. When I look at this photograph, I think to myself, this is a photograph also about teamwork. Because most importantly, you have the superintendent of the home who is looking at the camera. That is Donaldina Cameron, who's probably the best known superintendent. But there were a number of different women who ran it over the years. But standing next to her is a very important person to pay attention to, and that is her Chinese colleague, her Chinese aide. I don't know exactly who this was among the staff. But it's important because that Chinese aide was the woman who was going to interface, was going to speak with the vulnerable woman in the detective's arms first, and almost certainly would sit with her as she was interviewed by law enforcement or by immigration authorities. And this photograph is important to me because it shows that a lot of teamwork was involved in this project. It was not one person who did it. And it was teamwork that involved people from different cultures working together. The white Presbyterian woman, Donaldina Cameron in this case, and her Chinese colleague, Chinese or Asian colleague, who also often, but not always, converted to Christianity as a staffer. So we know from the records of the home that between 2,000 and 3,000 girls, women, and even a few boys came through the house during those 70 years of its operation. This is a photograph that was taken by Louis Stellman, and it is at the California State Library in Sacramento. And this is, I can recognize some of the faces of the people in here. But so we know that a lot of people came through the home over those years, many of them living there for a period of a few days to years. And there were babies born at the house, sometimes to the trafficked women. There were increasingly children who were dropped off at the home as it evolved over time to become more of a almost social services agency. And as I mentioned before, there were even a few boys, either who were born or who were the children of women who had taken refuge at this home. I love this photograph. This also is by Louis Stellman, and it also is at the California State Library. Again, this photograph to me is so important because it exemplifies the cross-cultural aspect of this project. The white women who had started it really could not do their work without the Asian women who worked beside them. And they not only worked together, but they lived together for so many years. And that's really interesting. And that's something that previous historians have really not focused on very much, the role of the Asian aides who were living and working at the home at the same time. Now, this is a closer view of Donaldina Cameron, who I mentioned before. Her family called her Dolly, and they originally came from Scotland. This is a photograph of her taken when she was 25 years old, and it was probably taken right before she traveled from the ranch on in Southern California up to Sacramento Street to start her job as a sewing teacher. And never again did I see her in white gloves and lace netting and, you know, little fur collar quite like that, because almost as soon as she arrived at the home, she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. And it was a very hard life that she embarked on. She did not spend a lot of money on herself or even taking care of herself. But she did a lot of good and changed a lot of lives over the years. Now, many challenges confronted Dolly and her colleagues over the years. And this photograph, again, I love to share because it captures so beautifully one of the biggest challenges that she faced. And of course, that was the 1906 earthquake and firestorms that destroyed much of San Francisco. This photograph is extraordinary because it was taken, I would guess, 50 yards up the hill on Sacramento Street from the mission home. So you're looking down towards the Embarcadero. And this is a photograph taken by Arnold Gente, who was a friend of Donaldina Cameron's over the years. And it's just a very powerful, powerful photograph. And this photograph is also a way for me to talk about why I got interested in this subject. As Joanne mentioned, you know, I was brought up in the Bay Area. I was born in Palo Alto. And I was looking around for the subject of a third book, a book that had something to do with San Francisco history, just because I love our area and I wanted to write about something here. And I came across the account that was written by Dolly Cameron of her experience and the experience of the residents of the home the morning and the days after the earthquake. And it was an incredibly moving account. I felt like I could kind of breathe the smoke and feel the chaos and feel the fear that was taking place. And after I read her account, I thought to myself, number one, I want to know more about her and this house. And number two, then I Googled it and I realized that house is still standing. It's still there. Number three, the historian in me said, if the house is still standing, maybe records survived the earthquake. And soon enough, I realized that wonderful church people keep incredibly good records. And so I am grateful to Presbyterians because we have this continual history of an institution from the 1870s through really the present day because of that sense of history. And so many other institutions and places in California, we don't have that continual history. We have a break, a very dramatic break around 1906, 1907. So that got me excited, like, wow, maybe I could tell the history of the city in a way through this specific home and through some of the lives of the people who came through the home. So that's what inspired me. Now, I want to tell you and focus on a few of the people who came through the home. And one of the great blessings of this project for me has been getting to know the descendants of some of the people who came through Cameron House over the years. And specifically, this is a woman named Tai Liang Schultz. And I have gotten to know her grandson just a little bit over the last few months. So let me tell you Tai's story very, very briefly. Tai was born in the United States, born in San Francisco, but like so many girls, particularly of I wouldn't say impoverished, but working families, she became a child servant to another family. And then her family decided that they wanted her to marry at a very young age. I believe it was 12. She did not want to get married, so she ended up running away to the mission home. And there she proved herself to be extraordinarily good with languages and very competent, so much so that Dolly Cameron put her up for a job at the newly opened Angel Island immigration station in 1910. And she became a translator there. She became the first Chinese American woman to work for the immigration services. And while she was there, she fell in love with a man who was also an employee of the immigration services. And at that time, California had laws that prevented the marriage of non-white people with white people. And so Tai and her beloved decided that they would follow the law and go to Washington State to get married instead, which they did. They came back to Angel Island, hoping to get their jobs back, and they were both fired. And they're resilient people. They managed to find a whole bunch of other jobs and interesting paths along the way and have a lot of children. But this photograph is very notable, the one of Tai behind the wheels of this car. The caption, this ran in the newspaper, and the caption described Tai as a progressive Chinese American woman, and also described her as perhaps the first Chinese American woman to cast a vote in a presidential election. And that's true. She did cast a vote in the primary in 1912, the presidential primary. But so many people helped me with this book. And one of the people who helped me was the wonderful historian Judy Young, who started off life as a librarian at the Chinatown branch. And Judy shared this photograph with me. But she did note that Tai actually never learned how to drive. So this was completely staged for the newspapers. The next person I want to tell you about also ran away from an arranged marriage to the home. And she had been brought up in a very kind of difficult, very difficult family situation. She gets to the home, and the staffers of the home realize she has got a gift. She's very, very bright. So they fight for her to get to go to a good high school in San Francisco. At that point, there was real educational segregation in the city, and very few Chinese Americans, especially Chinese American women, were permitted into the elite high schools. Not only that, but then they figured out a way for her to go to Stanford University. So she enrolls at Stanford. In 1927, she graduates as the first Chinese American woman to graduate from Stanford. This is her yearbook photograph that I tracked down when I went to Stanford's campus. That's not all. So Bessie then went on to medical school, and she ended up returning to the home and caring for its younger residents. This is in the 1920s and early 1930s, after the time when there was a separate home set up for the really young, much younger residents. It was known as the Baby Cottage, as you know. So that's the story of Bessie Jung. Now, this is probably the most remarkable story of transformation. And I always get, as they say in Hawaii, chicken skin when I tell this story. This is a photograph of a woman named Yamada Waka. And particularly right at the turn of the 20th century, there were a number of Japanese women who also took refuge at the home. And Yamada Waka was one of them. She had been trafficked from Japan to Seattle, had endured a brutal period of time as a prostitute, and decided she wanted to change her life. So she made her way to the home. She left the home shortly before the earthquake after marrying her tutor, went to Japan, and she and not only ended up becoming a leading feminist writer, but she wrote very specifically about the experience of being trafficked and her conversion to Christianity. And her words, it's so rare to have a trafficked woman write about the experience, that her words are, I think, one of the most remarkable things that I discovered in the course of this book. This is a photograph specifically of her standing in front of the White House in the 1930s. She was on a book tour, and she'd been invited by Eleanor Roosevelt to present, to talk with her and present her book to her. Now, the final resident of the home that I want to mention is Tien Fu Wu, who I think Joanne had mentioned. This is a photograph of Tien in her traveling suit. And I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that she had this photograph taken as she was on her way to a very elite boarding school in Philadelphia. But let me go back a little bit and tell you again about her story. Her story was that she was sold by her father to pay his gambling debts when they lived in China, ended up in a brothel in Chinatown, then was sold to someone else who badly burned and abused her, and her plight came to the attention of authorities, who brought her to Cameron House. And Tien grew up in the house, and again, she left quite a stunning record behind of her experiences of being a child and how she saw the world and her conversion to Christianity. And she too had a very sharp mind and was able to, through education in large part, really change the course of her life. So she found a sponsor. She went to the private boarding school in Philadelphia and then on to a Bible college in Toronto. She wanted to go back to China to find her beloved mother and grandmother. But there was so much chaos in those years that she couldn't find her family. And so she ended up realizing that her real family was at Cameron House, and she returned there and worked side by side with Dolly Cameron for decades. Now, I traveled all over the place for this book. I visited archives in Washington, D.C., the National Archives. I visited the Highlands Record Center in the Highlands of Scotland. Of course, Stanford, Berkeley, Yale's Divinity School. But one of the most remarkable places I went was to a very, very old cemetery in East Los Angeles called Evergreen Cemetery. It's one of the oldest in California. And for many, many years, Chinese people were not allowed to be buried with white people in the main part of the cemetery. So I wanted to go see the Cameron family plot. And I made my way there. And sure enough, there's Tien Fu Wu, who's buried in the plot. And I was just so touched by that. And I wanted to share this photograph with you as well, because it illustrates for me how close this history really is to us. Now, Dolly Cameron lived a remarkably long life. She was born in 1869. She died in 1968. She was almost 100 years old when she died. But I was able to meet members of her family who shared materials with me, shared family Bible, shared her letters, tell me their stories of their Auntie Dolly. And likewise, Tian Fu Wu, let's look at her. She only died in 1975. So there were people that I spoke with who remembered very distinctly Auntie Wu, who worked with Auntie Wu, and could tell stories to me about how they would make sure, or how she would help them celebrate their birthdays by bringing them chopsticks and Chinese food or something else. It was really something. And you know, the other thing that's so interesting about these long lives that these women had was that there were recordings of their voices and them telling the stories in their own voices, which are at Stanford. And it was after I heard those recordings that I really realized that I wanted to do this book. They were remarkable women, and their friendship, their lifelong friendship, was in a way what I wanted to focus on, because although they were so different, you know, Dolly came from a Scottish family, and Tian been sold by her father in China. You know, they both fundamentally were immigrant women who never married, who never had children of their own, but devoted their lives to acting on their Christian faith and serving others. And I thought that was a remarkable story. So that's why I wanted to tell it. Now, I suspect that almost everybody who's on this call has been to Cameron House. This is a photograph I took of the house a couple of years ago, right before the book, the hardcover, was published. And you can see the clinker bricks in the front. And of course, you know, it's now a very important community center in Chinatown, as well as an important social services provider for people. There's a weekly food pantry that's run out of Cameron House. And in the summers, there's still youth programs. A lot of kids still participate in those. At least they did before the pandemic hit. So what motivated the remarkable people who started this project, this very small project that lasted so long and changed so many lives? Well, I think it was their faith. I think it was a belief that the world could and should be a better place, and a kind of stubbornness, like we are going to work towards that goal. And so I'm so, as I say, honored to speak with you today. I can't wait for your questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. So excited to have you here with us today. Thank you for writing this book. And I just have to tell you, I was so captivated when I read it. I especially enjoyed reading about this history in the city I live in. I also loved reading about these strong women who were so determined and courageous in stopping sex trafficking of these young immigrant Asian women in Chinatown. I also was surprised by the correlation to Calvary, and I loved reading about that. And I am just so proud of our church and the history that the long history we've had with fighting racial and social justice inequities. So we continue to do that today, and we carry that on. So let's get to some questions, as Joanne mentioned. Some that I've prepared ahead of time that I collected from some of the people who are here today. And then I will try to get to a couple by, as Joanne also mentioned, raising your hands. So we'll get started. And I apologize ahead of time if we don't get to every question due to our time constraints. So here we go. So you talked so eloquently about what inspired you in writing this book and bringing out this somewhat unknown history. But I'm wondering, since the writing and the publishing of this book, have there been any unexpected ventures or stories you've uncovered as a result?
Thank you for asking that question. Yes, there have. So I've met some absolutely remarkable people. and I write about a few of them in my blog posts following the publication of the book. Civil rights workers, people who fought for low-income housing in Chinatown, just this incredible group of people who came out of Cameron House with a sense of social mission. And I feel very honored to have gotten to know a few of them. Also, I have to add that just to circle back to the PBS special, there was a project that was tied to women's suffrage, the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage this year. And it was a film project led by a group of women, and they wanted to do a short film on Tai Liang Schultz. And so I worked with them on that, and the film was absolutely wonderful, and I would urge anybody who's interested to take a look at it. Again, it's an inspiring story from our city of somebody who was really resilient and pretty inspiring. So that was fun, and Ty's grandson, Ted Schultz, was on the documentary as well, and since then he's been sharing some other material with me of family photographs and stories, and it's been a great journey. I mean, every book leads you in different directions. My book on Hawaii led me to just some incredible people as well, but because this is my home, it means so much more. And
that's great. I have seen that little documentary, and it's fantastic. I assume the link is it on your website?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah. I encourage everyone to watch that if you haven't. Let's see, you had mentioned the Occidental House, now known as the Cameron House. It's still around today. I personally, unfortunately, haven't visited, but in fact, I believe, you had mentioned you've gotten a lot of information for your book from their archives. I'm just wondering, how's it doing today? What's its current mission? Can we visit? That kind of thing, if you could share more about that.
Sure. So its current mission is as a community center social services provider for Chinatown. And it is struggling under the same COVID issues that the rest of us are, in that, many of its normal programs just currently aren't safe to run. I think it is still running the food pantry, and I also think it is still the social service department, which occasionally will deal with instances of trafficking, is still in operation. But the limitations of COVID have cut back on some of the big group gatherings that it has organized over the years. So, did I answer all your questions? I forgot.
Yes, you did. Anyone have a question? Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Let's see. Okay.
I would add that Cameron House has a new executive director named Mike Lee, who is just wonderful. He is warm. He is a great leader. He is committed to our community. He comes from outside of Cameron House. Actually, he came from Hawaii, and I've really enjoyed getting to know him. It's something.
That's great. There's so many disasters. You mentioned that, the fires, the earthquake, the bubonic plague happened during this time. I mean, it seems similar in some ways to today, ironically. But, how did those things really specifically affect immigrants, especially those young women who were tricked or illegally sold and transported to San Francisco, and any correlation to what's happening today? And any more that you can say about that would be just fascinating.
Well, I have to say my mind first goes to, in answering that question, goes to the emotional challenges of dealing with stress and disasters, particularly when you're insecure in terms of your housing or where your next meal is going to come from, or and I think that simply offering secure housing in whatever form it took. I mean, after the earthquake, that secure housing meant a barn for a week. Then it meant a super crammed house in Santa Fe. And then it meant a tenement in Oakland. But at least they were together, and as a group, they could look after each other and care for each other. And so I think if there's something common, it's the notion of a community staying together through disasters and being aware of the stresses, emotional, physical, and other ways that had on everyone. And I would say the immigrants, the young women who were trafficked, of course, also had to deal with trauma and work through the trauma. And there wasn't the type of therapy, the other things that we would use now to work through issues like that. There wasn't even really the kind of social services infrastructure that we take for granted in the city. I mean, that's why Cameron House is so remarkable. And I've been on, a campaign really to, at the very least, get more recognition for what was done there. I mean, look at Jane Addams. Jane Addams is considered the most important social services worker, social services pioneer in the country. But Hull House in Chicago was opened 15 years after Cameron House was opened. And, I really think there's an argument to be made that those Presbyterian women were pioneers who should be recognized for recognizing the issue of human trafficking and trying to do something about it. So, okay, I'll get off my bandstand here.
Okay, we have a question coming in from Amy Hockman. Amy, you want to unmute?
Actually, I was just laughing.
It's nice to see people. I'm glad to actually have face-to-face questions.
So yeah, I'm embarrassed to say I was just clapping because I just thought that was such a powerful statement, right, around the need. But I think we've got another one from Marion, maybe, or
Marion and Marcy and Dawn, I see with raised hands in the participants list.
So this is Marion over here, and Julia, you may recall that I recruited you to speak to our seniors group last October.
Oh yes,
but I believe I was not there because I was traveling, and our wonderful historian who passed away recently, Joe Byer, was your host for the day.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that about Joe, though.
And he knew so much history about Calvary. But I learned about you from Mildred Hall, who is our greeter at Calvary Seniors, but she's actually very active in the Chinatown Presbyterian Church, which is very involved with Cameron House.
Yes.
And to the question about how they're doing, I'm sure they're challenged a little bit because one of their big fundraisers has always been a big carnival they do in May, and I'm sure they could not do that. So just, I'm sure they need our prayers and our dollars if we have any spare ones. I say that, anyway, just saying that. But thank you for being here. What an enlightening conversation. I've been to the Hull House, and yeah, it'd be great if Cameron House got that kind of recognition. So thank you for this.
All right, Alvin. Can you unmute?
Unmute yourself.
I'm going to try to
There you go,
unmute.
Alvin. Hi, Alvin.
I really enjoyed your book, Julia.
Thank you.
I kind of brought a lot of memories back. I grew up in Chinatown in the late 30s and early 40s, and got introduced to Cameron House in 1948 when it was taken back from what it was doing before. After Donaldina Cameron the Presbyterian church rented out the building for a Chinese school, and they rented it to the school for $1 a year. And I did go to that Chinese school for all of 3 months, I think. I dropped out. Cameron House has really grown since 1948. It was, you mentioned in your book, Dick Wickman, who was the secretary at the Chinese YMCA at the time, and he became the director there and had a big influence. In fact, there was quite a few young people that went to seminary due to his ministry.
I think there were 50.
Including myself.
Oh,
and
okay.
After Donaldina Cameron came Lorna Logan, whom I met, and they moved their services up to a little house up on Wentmore Street. Wentmore is a little alley parallel to Powell and Mason between Washington and Jackson. It's just 1 block long. But anyway, I'm getting off the subject. I did some research, and if you don't mind, I'd like to share a picture of 933 Sacramento Street, which was the place that Margaret Culbertson used for her work at the beginning, before Donaldina Cameron. Let's see if I can get my
Oh, I'd love to see that. That's the little apartment, right?
Actually, I had a better picture, but I couldn't find it. But this is a picture. Let me see if I can get, I need to share the screen, so let me do this. Well, first of all, let me, my cursor is running all over the place. So let's see if I can share the screen now.
David, does he have the ability to share?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Can you see the picture?
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
This is part of the old mansion on 933 Sacramento Street. And what I want to share is another picture that, let me see if I can get to that. Does this show up?
Mm-hmm.
This is a picture, again, of Arnold Gentry taken after the earthquake. And you can see, let's see if I can do this right.
Julia, is this the picture you had as well?
It's in that same series. Yeah.
Yeah, this is right after the earthquake, or during the earthquake. Let's see. There's a way, anyway, off on the left hand, let me see, maybe I can just move my cursor over there. See my cursor here?
Mm-hmm.
See the front of this building? This is 933 Sacramento Street. After the earthquake, the whole front of the building was just fell all the way down. And then over here you can see 920 Sacramento Street, where Cameron House is now. Like Julia said in her book, oops. Well, sorry. I think I better stop sharing here. Like she said in her book, the building did survive the earthquake, but it was demolished because of the fires that were going up, and so they wanted to stop the fires, and that's what they did. anyway, that's the only contribution I want to make. Thank you.
May I ask you, Reverend Lee, did you stay in the youth programs after 1948? Did you participate in them?
Definitely. We did a lot of work with, at that time, Presbyterian Church had what they called commissions. And so we set up commissions that met after the Sunday evening English services. We would go from the church up to Cameron House and have our commission meetings. And we had Friday night club meetings and things like that. So we organized the youth program at that time with some other friends of mine, Ed Sue and Larry Jack Wong are some of the names. Al Sing Yoon did the best day of the week program too. But then when I graduated from Berkeley in 1953, I went to San Francisco Seminary, and so we participated weekends at Cameron House.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm writing an article right now about the later years of Cameron House, so I'm hoping maybe I could circle back to you and we could do an interview about that. I'd love to hear.
Oh, that's great. I'd love to hear that.
I'd be more than happy to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, I think we have time for just one last question. This was one actually Amy Hoffman had sent me. It'd be interesting.
Can I say something else? We shouldn't forget that Calvary has really kept in touch with Cameron House through Jane Newhall more recently, as many of you may have known that Jane did a lot of work with Cameron House in the later years. And then Doreen McLeod has worked a lot, I think also with Betsy Dobbs, so Betsy can mention something about her too.
All right, well, thank you, Alvin. So much great history and so great that you, can share that perspective since you were born and raised there and have so much history there. Thank you for that. So the last question from Amy was, it would be interesting to find out more about the research you did on the involvement of the different Presbyterian and other churches you write about. Other than Cameron House's archives, are there any other sources you'd recommend for us to understand the history of the Presbyterian churches in San Francisco and specifically about Calvary's participation? Do you have any other great sources?
Sure. Okay, so the Bancroft Library at Cal has got an absolutely spectacular collection, which is called the Presbyterian Church in Chinatown. And that is a very, very big collection and very fascinating. And I'm hoping that there will be more added to it soon, including more stuff from Cameron House. Looking wider, I've had a very good experience working with the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. In fact, they've been super helpful for the article I'm working on right now, even despite the pandemic. And they've got really good information about particular denominations. It's very complex the way the reporting goes. And so I didn't have very much luck with the Presbytery and finding records from there, but I did have more luck with national records kept originally in New York and then in Philadelphia. And the San Francisco Theological Seminary has a library. It is currently almost entirely shut down because I've been trying to get some material from them and it's been very difficult. Although I would imagine there is material on other congregations and, so that is a place I would check as well. So locally, Bancroft Library, you can see what they hold online. The Presbyterian Historical Society's got a great online system, and then the San Francisco Theological Seminary.
Wonderful. Yes, wonderful. Thank you again for being here today, for shining a light on this history, these brave women, story, and legacies. And on behalf of Calvary, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you want to learn more about Julia Flynn Siler, she has a great website with not only information on the White Devil's Daughters and more resources, but also on the other great books that she's written. So go to juliaflynnsiler.com. And if you want to find out more about Calvary Presbyterian Church in San Francisco, go to calpres.org. We're also on Facebook and YouTube. We have a whole library of other adult education films on the YouTube website. So you can check those out there. But with that, there will be information on a final slide. And again, thank you for joining us today. And I hope you have a blessed day. All right, take care.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Joanne.